Good morning. When Jim introduces one of our speakers, maybe an author or a pastor, somebody who's coming in, he likes to go on their website or like a Wikipedia article and get their little bio and then read it. And of course, half the time it's out of date or incorrect, but at least you try, and that's good. Unfortunately, our speaker this morning does not have a website of her own, nor does she have a Wikipedia article. But she happens to be someone that I've known for my entire life, so I thought I ought to be able to pull together some relevant facts to introduce her. So as I was doing that this morning, I put together this great little paragraph and then hit print and went out to the printer. This was at about 7:58. Went out to the printer, and the printer said sleep mode. So I went back to my computer, and the whole thing was like grayed out. So I was thinking fast. I pulled up the snipping tool, took a screenshot of the grayed out Word document, and then copied that over into MS Paint and printed that out. So I have my paragraph, but it's tiny and gray. So I'm going to do my best, but hopefully our speaker will do a better job than this. And before I do that, I just want to acknowledge a couple of other guests who are with us. My mom, Carol, and my Aunt Becky are here, so welcome them. Our speaker this morning has played many different roles over the course of her life. She has been a loving wife, mother of 10, grandmother of 26. You'll have to ask her how many great-grandchildren she has. She has been a prayer warrior, an author, the co-founder of a company. She once slept through a house fire. She has summited Mount Hood in Oregon, a feat, I might add, that her mountaineering son, Mark, has not yet accomplished. She once crawled under the Garfield Hotel in Winona Lake, Indiana, to shut off the water that was gushing from frozen pipes because there was no heat in the hotel where she was staying with her 4 young children for the winter. She was 9 months pregnant at the time. She's held a number of jobs at Tyndale House over the years. She once held John Hoffman's job for a while. She painted the walls of the original office building. After that, she held Paul Matthews' job. She was the financial manager until she retired in 1981. Before all that, she held Dan Elliott's job. She was the proofreader for the original manuscript of the Living Letters. That was a job that was dropped on her literally at the last minute as she was driving her husband to the airport for a 4-month-long trip. Thanks, honey. That's great. She is the co-founder of Tyndale House Publishers and the Tyndale House Foundation, a former board member, and one of the all-time great storytellers, my grandmother, Margaret Taylor.
Thank you for that rousing welcome. I asked for a stool so that I would be a little higher to see your faces. Jeremy already alluded to my first job with Tyndale, which was proofreading living letters, the epistles from Romans through Jude. And as he said, we were on the way to the airport when Ken said, Margaret, you will have to proofread living letters. And I said, I've never proofread a thing in my life. Remember, I was a home ec major. Well, you can spot misspellings or if a line has been omitted. That's part of the job. You look at the original manuscript and compare it with the printed manuscript on the galleys. Galleys? What are... I thought that was something on a boat. And send me a copy of what you're doing. it all sounded pretty complicated to me. Oh, another thing. I don't know the proofreader's marks. How after you find something that's wrong, what do you do? He said, any dictionary has a page of proofreader's marks. I used to believe me. The first galleys, which turned out to be long sheets of paper, newsprint kind. So I draped them over the back of one of our dining room chairs, and it was 9 o'clock at night before I could get at it. We still had 7 children at home, so there was plenty to do. The first thing I noticed was semicolons everywhere. And even though I wasn't an English teacher, I had picked up the idea that semicolons were passé. And my son John later confirmed this. He was teaching English in a junior college in California, and he said they no longer even looked at the chapter on semicolons. So I tried putting in periods and replacing the semicolons. It made rather short sentences in some places, but... And there were so many commas. I thought there were too many. Also, exclamation points. Exclamation points in the Bible? I didn't think there was in the King James. I took out a few. Anyway, they said, in effect, wow, did you ever think of that after some sentence in the Romans or Hebrews? When Ken came home from the 4-month trip, his voice was, well, he had written about it because it had come on right at the beginning. 4 months is a long time to be talking every day where you're the scheduled speaker. And once in Portugal, where he was the speaker at a lunch, his voice gave out completely. I hope mine won't this morning. And he just had to sit down. Because the proofreading had taken longer than anticipated, we didn't have all of the books like this ready, but the printer saw to it that 8 or 10 copies were hand-bound and delivered to our house because we would need them the very next week for the Christian Booksellers Convention, which was in Chicago that year. But before the convention, my husband did something that was very private. Well, first, he wrote in his autobiography about the highlight of the trip was finding a package waiting for me in Jerusalem. It contained the galley proofs of living letters to see the manuscript actually in type after those 7 years of writing, rewriting, editing, revising was a glorious experience. I left my hotel and walked across the Kidron Valley to the Mount of Olives, and with great excitement read the entire manuscript, this whole book. Then began rejoicing before the Lord. I felt I'll skip that. After I completed the reading, I sat there looking across to the city of Jerusalem and prayed that God would use this work for his glory. The thought came to mind that I was sitting in the very land where Jesus used 5 loaves and 2 fish to feed 5,000 people. I had in my hands what was going to be 2,000 copies of Living Letters. And I thought of those copies as 2,000s of loaves to feed God's people. Then I worked out on paper a simple mathematic equation. If 5 loaves fed 5,000 people, how many would 2,000 loaves feed? The answer was 2 million. This was, of course, utterly impossible. Nevertheless, I bowed my head and prayed earnestly that someday 2 million copies of Living Letters would be in print. And that came to pass eventually before Living Letters as a separate book went out of print. And when he came home and actually saw and handled one of the books, I didn't know how to thank God adequately, but I thought of the offerings by fire made by the people of Israel, as described in the Old Testament. There was a brush pile in our back field waiting to be burned, and I started a fire under the pile. I stood there in the presence of God with this first copy of Living Letters and prayed again the prayer I had prayed on the Mount of Olives, that God would use this little book mightily for his glory. Then I sank to my knees in thanks to God that the work was finished. When the fire was burning brightly, I took the precious copy and with great emotion threw it reverently into the midst of the flames as the offering of the first fruits to my God. This was such a private act of worship that I told no one about it for 25 years. I went with my husband to the hotel in Chicago to help him out with his voice, which was really shot. It was difficult for him to speak. He had rented half of a 10-foot booth. Now, a 10-foot booth is pretty small compared to what Moody Press and Zondervan and the other big publishers had. My husband had been the director of Moody Press for 16 years, and so he was well known in the industry by people and who had come to prior conventions. But this little 5-foot booth was way back in the back of the convention hall. But as people came by, Ken would try to say to them, "Hey, Joe, look here." See this? This is a paraphrase of the New Testament, of the epistles. Can you take time to read one of your favorite passages and see how it sounds? Of course, he couldn't get everybody to stop that long. One man came by and said, "Hi, Ken, nice to see you. You've got some good books this year. I just left my order. Gotta go now. I have an appointment with Bernie Zondervan." In the end, I should say, who had the other half of the booth? Another couple with just one product. Their product was offering plates, plastic ones, molded plastic. Not a bestseller in Christian bookstores. There was a little sign behind us that said Tyndale House Publisher, Sweeton, Illinois. Of course, nobody had heard of that before because we were brand new. And people didn't connect. If they looked at it, they didn't connect it with Ken, even though he was sitting there or standing in the aisle most of the time, because the booth was so tiny you couldn't get anybody in, and so it was easy for them to just say hi to Ken and move on. At the end of the convention, we had orders for about 800 copies of the 2,000 that we had having lithocolor press print. Lithocolor press was the commercial printing arm of Good News Publishers, which were known at that time for the unusual and attractive tracts that they published. Before long, the first 1,000 copies were delivered to our house. And I'm going to sidetrack to tell you about the house. After 10 moves in the first 8 years of our married life, though when I say moves, don't think furniture. We didn't own any furniture, and every place we lived was furnished, even to dishes. We were married in Portland, Oregon, at a service that started at 8, and we were leaving on the train at 9:30. And my husband was a student at Dallas Seminary for 3 years, and then was asked to come to Chicago to edit his magazine for InterVarsity, and he knew that he was interested in journalism. And so he took that job and then finished at Northern Baptist Seminary and got his master's degree in theology. But we were in rented houses, or this old hotel that Jeremy mentioned in Winona Lake, the 8th year. And I had 4 children already and was pregnant with the 5th. We came back to Wheaton, to a professor's home for the summer, but this was right after the World War, and there had been no houses built for years, And with the veterans coming back, there was a huge pressure for any housing. And we literally could not find anywhere to live. And after Labor Day, good friends of ours, Ted and Mary Lou Benson, said, well, you could put your beds up in our basement. Well, it was a tiny little house on College Avenue, and they had 6 children, and we had 5 children, only 1 bathroom. And we were waiting with Douglas and Virginia Muir, and some of you recognize Virginia's name, a long-time employee at Tyndale later, for a house on the edge of Geneva, Glenelg, what's our neighboring? Glen Ellen. It was a big house, but we had been cautioned about not signing any papers because it was occupied by 5 families, and they would have to vacate before we could move in, and the Muirs would have 1 floor, and we would have another floor. So before that happened, we were told about a piece of property with 2 houses on it in Wheaton, not very far away from the Glen Ellen border. The total price was $15,000, and we elected to take the older house. So our portion was $6,300. Well, that would indicate to you that it was not much of a house. When my older sister Harriet came from Detroit for a visit, well, Margaret, what I think you should do is tear it down and start over. Well, big sisters are always right, aren't they? So we tore it down. But not for 18 years. A few years after we moved in, a neighbor told me that actually the house was remodeled from a barn. And the original shape of it would confirm that maybe it had been, and the fact that it didn't have a foundation. It was just set on rocks in the corners, and then tin was wrapped around it to disguise the fact that there wasn't a proper foundation. One year, one corner of the house was starting to sag, and my husband spent hours jacking it up. And if milk spilled in the kitchen, it always ran under the refrigerator. The original barn had been added onto with 2 enclosed porches, one across the front and then the other one across the end. And then the big windows were put in. But the windows looked out on the porches rather than outside to see the pheasants that we still had at the edge of Wheaton. Now we have foxes, believe it or not. Saw one this week. Eventually, as we had more children, we had to move the boys from one of the little bedrooms upstairs to the front porch. Well, then the windows looked out on their bedrooms. Not good. So we took out the glass and put in 2 bookcases. And the window that looked out on the porch on the end got broken so many times from the kids throwing balls in the house that we took out the glass and just left it out. So then the boys could leapfrog from the living room into the dining room. And the dining room eventually was the first office for Tyndale House. That's why I'm giving you all this explanation. And the first year, I typed the invoices and the labels. We didn't have any printed. We just had a rubber stamp, Tyndale House Publishers, and Wheaton. And the Muirs had moved. They had lived next door for several years, but they had moved away, and believe it or not, we're coming back to Wheaton. And she let me know that if I were too busy, she could come to work. So if the mail came in the middle of the morning, and if there were more than the usual number of orders, which were increasing eventually, then I could call her to come to work, and she could give me help that way. That was flex time before we had, that word had been invented. Sometimes little Mary Lee, who was 7, would answer the phone, and then, "Mommy, come quick. It's that lady we can't understand." Well, I knew who she was talking about, a German lady in New Jersey who worked at a deaconry and had a little bookstore, apparently. And she would order 1 copy at a time. So we got used to hearing her on the telephone. Or another time, "Mommy, Mr. Bryce called, and he wants 2, I don't know whether he wants 2 dozen eggs or whether he wants 2 copies with the bashed corners of living letters. Mommy, would you call him?" Or another time, "Mommy, they want the order department." Who is the order department? We were pretty small peanuts, I can tell you. But God was blessing. And we were getting letters, my husband was, from readers who were finding Romans and Hebrews understandable, as he had worked 7 years writing and rewriting 6 times in all. Fortunately, the rest of the Bible was easier for him, and he didn't have to spend years on the subsequent books that came out following Living Letters. We had a friend and he didn't seem to have a job anymore, but he had enough money, and he became a follower of Billy Graham, going to every convention, every conference that he was having. And he would set up the chairs, just make himself useful. And finally, he became a personal assistant to Billy Graham. Doug Judson was his name. We called him Uncle Doug. And Ken had, of course, sent one of the first copies of Living Letters to Doug. And he kept talking about it to Billy Graham. You ought to read this. But he didn't have time until he was ill and recuperating in Hawaii. And then he read it cover to cover and became excited about it and talked to other members of his team. And I don't know whose idea it was, but the idea, really quite earth-shaking, was to give away paperback copies of Living Letters to listeners of the next major telecast. Now, they had never given away a book before. No evangelist on the radio or TV had given away a book. So they asked Ken for permission to give away 50,000 copies. Ooh. And since we didn't have a TV, we never have had one, we didn't see the telecast ourselves, where it was announced, write to Billy Graham and we will send you a free copy of Living Letters. And whoever was making the announcement would elaborate a little on it. Some weeks later, George Wilson called my husband and said, you know, you gave us permission for 50,000 copies. And Ken, oh no, they've got 20,000 left or something like that. No, it was the other way around. We have had to go back to print. They were using a major printer in Minneapolis and handling everything that had to do with this paperback. We've gone back to print over and over again, and we have mailed 600,000 copies. 600,000. In the initial talk about this business of a free copy, Billy himself apparently raised the question of royalty. No, Ken said no royalty, and they insisted that there be royalty, so it was 5 cents, not what would be the normal royalty. It was less, but 600,000 copies, 5 cents, comes to $30,000. That would have bought us a pretty good house. But you can believe me, that thought never crossed my husband's mind, not once. He was not unhappy in this old house that when our girls were in high school, they were so ashamed of it that they never invited friends home, I'm sorry to say, because my husband and I did entertain. The 30,000 was the beginning of the Tyndale House Foundation. And it was my husband had already had the idea for a foundation, and unlike major foundations, his idea was to give away all of the money that accumulated during a year, which has been the practice through the years now to the tune of several $1 million a year. Thank the Lord. So the next convention was in Washington, D.C., and our Mark accompanied, and our daughter Janet. And since the convention floor didn't open until the afternoon, we had mornings for sightseeing. And so Mark wrote about that. This summer, Mom and Dad and Janet and I went to Washington, D.C. Mainly we went because of the Christian Booksellers Association convention, where Dad had booths for Living Letters and the Christian Reader. We sat in on Congress, climbed to the top of the Washington Monument, visited the Smithsonian Institute, and went to the FBI building. Lots of things we had to leave for our next trip there. This is from our Christmas letter. Margaret is office boy and delivery boy for Tyndale House. The latter job was a natural after the years of chauffeuring the children to and from their activities. She may work into being the bookkeeper too. Our office is in the dining room, and since our early fall, we have had outside help with invoicing, subscriptions, etc. When we get out a promotional mailing, then all of several thousand pieces, all hands fall too, and that would especially have included Gretchen 9, Mary Lee 8, and Allison 7. And after a few hours of stuffing, they would be rewarded with an ice cream cone. And this is the big news that Ken wrote. Yes, the retirement for Daddy. Yes, after 16 wonderful years at Moody Bible Institute, I felt increasingly that I should take off a couple of years for writing now, while interested and able, rather than trying to crowd it in while commuting and during evenings, weekends, and vacations, as in the past. September 30 was my last day at work. Since then, I've been hard at work on the second draft of Living Prophecies, the major and minor prophets. And the book will also include the book Revelation. Progress is very slow, but fairly steady. And I may be finished in another year or two. Income from the sale of living letters is making this time away from normal income practical. So God was answering his prayer on the Mount of Olives for a wide distribution, even 2 million copies. And it actually went higher than that when you include the paperback copies from the Billy Graham Association. And jumping ahead, God had plans in mind from the beginning. The cooperation between Tyndale and the Billy Graham Association, because they gave away free paperback copies of every part of the Living Bible, Living Prophecies, Living Gospels, the New Testament, and the books, historical books, and eventually the whole Bible. Consequently, it became the best-selling book, the Living Bible, for 2 or 3 years, and then Publishers Weekly and the New York Times quit saying that it was the best-selling book because they said, well, it always is. But when they say it always is, that included all of the publishers that were putting out Bibles, and not a new Bible rewritten by just one person and published by one publisher. So it really made publishing history. Are there any questions?
I don't know how to phrase this. Dr. Taylor, okay, you went away for 4 months. He handed you a big project. You have all these little kids. You're a married woman. Did you feel stress and... You know what I'm saying? Were you ever really mad at him? Giving you the $30,000 toward a house and putting it back into the foundation. Were there those times where you just wanted to be mad at him?
Well, actually, because Tyndale House did get such a start, that after we had moved to offices in an apartment house, in the basement of an apartment house on Washington Street, right by the tracks. It wasn't long then before we built a house on the same property. Those lots that the Muirs and we had were 2 city blocks deep, and then there wasn't a street back there, and it was a field. So we had a lot of property, and we built a house that we currently live in the front yard, and lived in the old house while it was being built. And the new house did cost $30,000. But it wasn't the $30,000 from the Billy Graham Association. I'll pray as we close. Dear Father in heaven, what a privilege you have given these people in this assembly in working for Tyndale House, because it is working for you to get out more Bibles, books about the Bible, and other good books. Thank you for those who went to Springfield yesterday to testify that marriage is between a man and a woman. You have been so good to us, and you love us. Help us to love you more and more as we serve you. In Jesus' name, amen.